You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
Please be aware that this conversation does discuss child abuse as well as suicidal ideation. If those things are triggering for you, it might be best to give this episode a miss. The older kids stand at the front of the line, waiting obediently and silently for their punishment. At 5, Daniella Mestyanek Young is the youngest. She will go last, after hearing the loud smacking sound of the wooden paddle strike all of the bare bottoms in front of her. You're not allowed to cry. That just means more wax. But Daniella is terrified and shaking, and she can't help herself. Even at such a young age, she can't help but feel like this isn't fair. Why are they being punished? But this is the reality of life within the church, known as the children of God, or the family. And harsh discipline isn't the only thing that's normalised. Daniella says child labour, medical neglect, and, most disturbingly, child sexual abuse is too. She experienced it, as did her mother before her. For the unindoctrinated, the first rule of living in a cult is you are not in a cult. The brainwashing starts at birth, and the systemites, the outsiders, they're the evil ones. Growing to 15,000 members in 130 communities around the world at its peak, the family has been at the centre of multiple police investigations over the decades. But as the children who grew up there turn into adults and make their escape, their stories, like Daniella's, make it impossible to hide the truth. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. But this month, instead of deep diving into one criminal case each episode, we've been looking behind the crime. And today, we're talking to someone who's been behind the scenes in the Children of God cult. Daniella Mestyanek Young was born into this religious sect and spent her childhood behind the tall gates of communes in places like Brazil and Mexico, until at the age of 15, she escaped. Daniella joins us today to discuss her experience of living in a cult and the lasting impact it's had on her life. Daniella, I want to start with your mum. She gave birth to you at the age of 15. Tell me about her life and the circumstances as to which she was pregnant at 15.
Yeah, so my mom was born into the Children of God cult, and her father was the one that joined the cult originally, both her father and her mother. Her grandmother, my great-grandmother, actually donated property to the prophet early on, was so happy about her children going off to serve God. And then my grandfather became the financial manager for this entire organization. And so my mom was born, she was one of the first children born in the Children of God. She grew up in the hub of this leadership circle, right there in the middle of everything as it progressed from this group of hippies talking about love, faith, and Jesus through pedophilia and the apocalypse. And when she was 13, she was actually sent with a whole group of teenage girls to the prophet for what they called teen training. And there was, a wedding ceremony of all of these girls that ranged from 14 to 3.
Who were they marrying?
They were marrying the prophet, who was about 75. In theory, it was this symbolic ceremony where they were marrying Jesus. But of course, they all spent time alone with the prophet. And then when my mother was 14, the young girls at this time were sort of involved in this entire world of what I usually call forced polyamory, because they called it free love, but it certainly was all top down who you were supposed to sleep with. And so my mother gets pregnant at 14, is impregnated by her dad's boss in this finance system. And this man is a couple years older than her father, but so much inside of this system. And, she nursed me for about a year, and then I was just fully incorporated into the group.
Let's talk a little bit more about the prophet and the starting of this cult. So it's the Children of God, and it started in 1968 by David Berg. What was his initial vision?
David Berg grew up under the American evangelical revival tradition. His mother was a famous evangelical preacher in the 30s and 40s. And so he, as many cult leaders, is this kind of failed wannabe preacher who's tried a few things, and he's in his 50s, and he sees this opportunity in California and in the whole hippie movement in the United States to start gathering followers and do it outside of the world of the church as it's been done before. So it did start as this movement of love, faith in Jesus, and people join new religions because they're looking for something. So it was this band of believers, traveling around the country and then the world trying to convert people. But of course, in the meantime, he creates this world of total obedience and absolute total isolation. So by the time my mother's born, and certainly by the time I'm born, we are 10,000 people strong living around the world in these communes of 100, 150 people with almost no access to the outside world unless we are trying to raise money from you or convert you to our faith.
When you say all over the world, I know you've lived all over the world as a member of the Children of God. Do we have any kind of sects here in Australia?
So yes, there was a big amount of people in Australia. Australia is actually one of the 4 countries, I believe, that tried to go against the Children of God. And there was a lawsuit, there was interest in trying to protect the children. Ultimately, it did not work. But Australia, is one of the countries that thought, hey, what's going on here is a little weird, and we want to get to the bottom of this.
What do you have to do, or more probably likely give up, to join the Children of God?
Everything. This was the concept. You were to forsake all. You were to drop out of the system, which is the outside world. That's you guys. And you had to, completely cut off any relationship with your family. You had to give up all of your physical possessions, all of your money, any property you had. Everything was given to the group. And this was all based on, the supposed lives of the early apostles of Jesus. And then, I think a thing that people miss a lot is you then give a lifetime of your labor, because cults ultimately are about labor. And that is so much what the Children of God became.
Is that labor to earn money for the group, or is it just labor in general?
It's labor in general, because it relates to power. In our case, it turned into labor to earn money, but it's labor to keep the group going, right? So this labor can come up in a lot of ways. And then our group turned into sex trafficking quite heavily in the 70s. By the 80s and 90s, they had started to realize that childhood entertainment videos were a great way to, one, make money, and also sort of whitewash your image for the world. And so my life, actually, I was this little baby actress from the age of 1 to the age of 10, singing, dancing, performing in all these videos. And then, hundreds of thousands of us would sell them on the streets around the world.
What were you singing?
We were singing regular religious songs. We were singing a lot of music that was created by our organization. And this was actually the part of the leadership that I grew up in, were the people, the musicians that wrote the songs and the people that processed all of the literature. So we were sort of this creative hub.
Let's go back to your childhood because, we mentioned that your mum was a teenager, a child really, when she had you. What did it look like for you to be born into the commune as a baby? You lived in a nursery for most of that time as a kid, didn't you?
We absolutely lived in nurseries, I would imagine from probably about 6 weeks old, maybe even younger. And, all the babies were breastfed, whether that was by your mother or somebody else's mother. And my childhood, I describe the most as I grew up in this institution of 150 people. We probably had around 50 to 60 kids. And we just walked in straight lines. We never spoke out of turn. We were sort of constantly disciplined and really expected to be these perfect little children that were the perfect soldiers of God, no matter what your age. I would say I would see my mother for an hour a day, right, for dinner and about 30 minutes after dinner. And then you would go back to your dorm room. And the whole idea of the children of God, which also called themselves the family, was you are supposed to forsake your family to serve God. So even though you have a nuclear family, they are not supposed to be more important than everyone else that lives in your commune. And if you do anything wrong, you can lose your family at any point in time. And so I had grown up with my mother losing her mother who had left the cult when she was young. And I definitely remember, just living in constant fear that my mother would be taken away because of either something she did or something that I did.
So the other kind of adults around you, what did you refer to them as? Were you allowed to call your mother mother?
Yes, we called our parents mom and dad, but we called all adults in the home either uncle or auntie. And then they all had biblical names. So nobody used their real names either, which is another very key way that you operate around the world doing so much abuse out in the open, because most of us do not even know the legal names of these uncles and aunties who had so much power over our lives.
Ah, and outside people, they had a name as well.
Yes. This is very important in cults. So, we are the family and you are the systemites. I cannot describe to you, right, how much evil goes along with this word. And, so as we talked about, when someone joined the children of God, you were supposed to forsake all and drop out of the system. And so the system is the world. It is all of you that do not know about David Berg, the prophet, and God's true word and are not in God's army. And this sort of us versus them setup is absolutely fundamental to coercive control, whether you are, a dictator somewhere or a cult leader or what have you.
I want to get to some of the more troubling aspects of what adults were allowed to do while you were living there. But to start with, more surface level stuff. What were the rules in terms of, did you have to wear certain things? Were you allowed technology? What did your day-to-day look like in that aspect?
So we definitely weren't allowed sort of free access to anything. So while the group always used cutting edge technology to create their wares for sale, we recorded music. We all knew how to sing and perform and dance, but we weren't allowed to listen to any music that was created outside of the children of God. We weren't allowed to read any books that were from outside of the children of God. And we didn't have specific rules about what to wear. I think part of that is because we were so international that would be pretty hard to do. And not to mention, it makes you stand out. Our number one rule was that you could not look cool. So anything considered cool, anything considered worldly could absolutely get you in trouble. And that could change at any given point. Looking too cool, I think, makes you an individual, right? And in these total institutions, you are never supposed to be an individual.
What about healthcare? Because you talk about the hospital being considered an evil place.
We absolutely did not do doctors. It's a bit confusing sometimes because cult leaders go on their whims, and we were so large. So it, sort of depends where you were at. And most women gave birth in hospitals, not until the point where it is obvious that you can't come back from this injury, that you were allowed to be taken to the hospital. And the whole concept was, God doesn't make mistakes. So if you are sick or you have had an accident, God did this to you. God is trying to teach you. So not only, are you supposed to be in prayer and be asking God what he's trying to teach you, but you're also not supposed to necessarily go to a modern hospital and have them make your punishment better, let's say.
Was that confusing as a child when you did end up in hospital for certain things? You broke an arm at one point, you ended up going to hospital. Would that have left you terrified of being there?
I was certainly terrified of doctors. Looking back, it's obvious that we were taught to fear all regular authority figures. So we were taught that school and teachers were bad. We were taught doctors were bad, police, all of this stuff. But then, I didn't have any normal doctor's appointments. So my very first encounter with a medical professional is in the emergency room, and it is horrific. So yes, I would say it's confusing. And there's this mix in our whole lives, I think, of wanting the outside world, but also being extremely afraid of the outside world, because that's what we've been taught.
Because you had a lot of rituals in the cult, which I found really interesting. Things like going on outings. So you would go on picnic days and go to the seaside, which sound like things that ordinary kids would do. So did that give you a little bit of a taste, or was it a very different kind of experience?
Yeah, it did give you a little bit of a taste. And, I feel like I got really lucky because I got to grow up in Brazil and Mexico and experience, a bit of the culture, though certainly never really being immersed. But, it seems that there was a lot of work done to convince us that we were normal families, or to convince the outside world that we were normal families. And so, you go on this family outing once a year and you have this time and you do these normal family things. It makes it harder looking back to say, oh, this was manipulative or abusive. The cult members can point to these certain good memories or times that you were allowed to do something and try to discredit you. And I believe that was the reason that we were allowed to sometimes do some of these things.
I think it's worth pointing out to the listeners and asking you this right now. How many siblings do you have, Daniella?
So I have 24 siblings in what I call cult math, which is, a biological father and 2 stepfathers. And all 3 of those men being in this cult have many other children. So no, I don't know all of them.
So did your mum give birth to all 24?
No, my mother gave birth to 8 children, and she gave birth to 7 of them by the age of 30.
As a young child, you watched your mum have baby after baby after baby, every few years. What did you notice about the toll that took on her body?
She had really hard pregnancies, which I think is just a given when you start when you're 14 and your body is not ready, and she never even had time to recover in between. So she was always basically constantly nursing or pregnant or nursing again. And we lived under conditions of not a lot of money, not a lot of food. And I definitely know that I started noticing by her 5th child that I did not think she was sort of physically able to handle it. And sure enough, by baby number 7, we had a very severely handicapped child with spina bifida that, is related to sort of the depletion of the right things that you need in your body to grow a child.
One of the rituals that really shocked me about what happened to your mum was when you spoke about her 12th birthday. Can you tell me what happened that day?
Yes. So on her 12th birthday, this was the prophet at the time. His declaration was that once girls have reached the age of 12, which is tied to the Bible, they have reached their physical maturity. And certainly once they have hit puberty, God intends for them to have babies. So my mother, who lived away from her father most of the time, is greeted on her 12th birthday by her father, this man she hasn't seen since she is 9 years old. And he toasts her with a glass of wine, congratulates her on becoming an adult. And then she's asked by these aunties who are in charge of arranging the sexual sharing schedule to make a list of which of the men she would like to have sex with first. And, this is one of those interesting differences, I think, between the way my mom was raised as one of these first kids and was just groomed from birth, that her job in life was to be this basically sexual slave to anyone in the group, versus when I was growing up, it was still being done, but it was being done very much more in secret. But I think the grooming of the older generation was really awful in the ways that it trapped them into thinking they wanted to be there for so much longer than those of us, I think, that grew up later on.
Did she ever vocalize to you that she thought that was wrong?
Not in the beginning. Growing up, it was always very, very positive. And in my mind, my mom was the true believer. She was the perfect, child of God who was always doing the right thing. And for example, I heard of this marriage ceremony to the prophet when I was young, but it was positive. She wore the wedding ring her whole life. It was this honor to be chosen. It wasn't until I was 19 in college. My mother, I think, was already starting to break away from the cult at this point, but she was still in the cult. At one point, she came to visit me. And so I took her on a road trip for 4 hours. And as soon as the doors were locked, I said, okay, now you're telling me the whole story of your life, and we are going to walk through it. And I think that was the first time that both she and I were really able to look at some of those events of her life and see them for what they were, rather than this, propaganda that had been taught to her whole life.
You mentioned that it wasn't so much of a ritual when you went through, but you also experienced sexual abuse as a child. Was she aware of that?
That's always a difficult question to answer. I think that everyone in the group, when it first started, was following what the prophet was telling them to do with children, unless they completely broke away. Then at some point they changed the rules. And so I think the quote unquote good disciples stopped with the sexual abuse towards children, but the creepy uncles, as we call them in the book, didn't. Right. And I think in any kind of organization where you change a rule, but you don't go back in and change the value, they were never willing to call what the prophet had said wrong or abusive. And we were all still raised in this environment of constant physical abuse, sexual abuse. We had children's cartoons teaching us how to give your body to your attackers in the end times for God, right? And so I find it a bit interesting when some of the grown-ups say that they didn't know what was going on, because while maybe they didn't know the exact details, they certainly knew this over-sexualized environment that we were all growing up in.
Well, it almost seems like it would have been inevitable if it was so enmeshed in the way that the elders then passed it down.
Yes. And I think that was one of the very confusing things for me, was that, I would be isolated all of the time for punishments because I was this trouble child that always questioned, was never quiet, was never trusting God. I was always asking why. And so I would find myself at the brunt of these very extreme physical punishments and often very extreme sexual punishments in private, hidden away. And part of me always assumed that my mom knew what was going on because she had grown up in it too. And because at this point, I'm so young, I'm too young to understand that the rules had changed. There was actually a point in discussing it with my mom where she said, they outlawed the sexual abuse in 1986. And I said, well, nobody told me that until 10 years later when they gave us this Charter of Rights. And so it simply just wasn't being done publicly anymore. And we didn't have the words or the idea of freedom to even fight back. We just felt that we deserved whatever we were getting.
How old were you when it started?
I don't really have a direct answer for that. I think before the age of 5.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Daniella Mestyanek Young, who was raised in the Children of God cult. Let's focus a little bit more on the discipline side of things, because that was a kind of core belief in the Children of God. Why? What was the belief there around disciplining children?
It's all based on this Bible verse that says, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. And our prophet believed that, children were sinful and babies as young as 6 months old needed to be spanked and needed to be sort of trained in this very extreme sense of, according to them, good discipline. And part of it, I think, was just practicality. When you have hundreds of kids running around in a single area, you must have a lot of discipline and a lot of rules. And part of it, I think, was just the way things get out of control when you completely disenfranchise children and then give a whole group of unrelated adults complete power over them.
But these punishments, they sound like torture. What were some of the punishments that were given out?
So, one of the interesting ones, of course, is group spankings. So these I find really interesting because the point of group punishments is to get the group to police itself, right? So I think that's one of the most insidious things, was that they had us all living in this North Korea prisoner camp, because you never know who's going to tell on you to get you in trouble, because they are so worried that if they don't, we will all get in trouble. So we had so many group punishments, and a lot of them were either different types of beatings or different types of stress positions. So you're going to stand for an hour with your hands out with a Bible on your hands, or you're going to, stand really still in this tiny square and not get to move. They used a lot of isolation. They used a lot of, the washing your mouth out with soap. And this thing they called silence restriction, I think, was one of their most devious ones, because they didn't actually isolate you. You were physically there with your peers going through all the motions. You were just essentially a silent monk. You were not allowed to speak to anyone for anything for any reason. And often if you did, your punishment would just get extended more days. And so I have memories of being 7 years old and not being allowed to speak for 2 weeks straight, for example.
How do you even enforce that on a 7-year-old? I guess you're so scared.
Yeah. And I think that is really one of those things that sometimes gets missed. Sometimes when we look at these children in these repressive religions, it really stands out if you've ever seen a documentary on Waco, the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. And it's like their children were so well behaved. They would sit for up to 3 to 4 hours in the middle of the night just watching their prophet speak. And that's not normal, right? I have a 7-year-old. She has never sat still for even 1 hour. It was the fear of punishment, but it was also the constant uncertainness, because you never knew one thing could make an adult mad at you The next day, the adult wouldn't care. Maybe another adult would think it was precocious and funny. You just had no idea how anyone was going to react, including your own parents, because often one thing that your parents would let you get away with just fine when it was just you and your family in front of another family, in front of God and all the witnesses, they would have an absolutely different reaction.
And when you talk about these more physical punishments, were they drawing blood? Were they leaving bruises? They were quite hard, weren't they?
I mean, I think you could find examples of the absolute full range of punishments. And certainly we lost kids, right? We lost kids to overly harsh discipline and to medical neglect. And it wasn't that rare.
I want to touch on suicidal ideation, if you're okay with me going there, because you started thinking about death from a very young age.
Yeah, I was about 6 when I remember thinking of it the first time. And from many, many, many of my fellow cult babies, we call ourselves, started thinking of it around 3 to 4 years old. And, this to me is such a signal of really how bad it was, right? Really, you cannot brainwash children under these conditions to believe in your way. Like, it was just too awful that it was breaking most of us. And I, definitely went on to struggle with suicidal ideation for a lot of my adult life. And so many of my peers are still dealing with that every day. It wasn't until I started studying group psychology and learning about, you spend all this time studying social identity theory, and you spend all this time studying personal identity and how that is formed between the ages of 1 and 6. And what was done to us was we were entirely broken of any and all personal identity. So we never got to develop that. And we need to, in our adult lives, we need to first figure out that we never got to develop that and then learn how to do it. I think that's one of those really hard transition things that comes no matter how successful you are afterwards.
Well, aside from those thoughts that you were having at 3, that is a mind-boggling age to even think that a child can conceptualize what that means. But you did also develop a lot of kind of nervous tics or things that you now look back on and go, oh, that was a bit unusual. Can you talk us through some of those?
Oh, yeah. I bite my nails. I still kind of do quite badly, sort of ripping the skin, tearing the skin. I had this tic where I would make this sound in the back of my throat. And it, I think should be rather obvious to grown-ups, but maybe I'm speaking in today's world. And it was just the fact that sometimes I would make this sound and I couldn't control it, but sometimes I wouldn't make that sound, was seen as a sign of my absolute willfulness and rebelliousness. And, I think my biggest one was that I started wetting my bed after years of being potty trained. And that very clearly in my mind correlates with the sexual abuses that started happening around that age.
And when you did wet the bed, were you then punished for that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So it was just a cycle.
Yeah. I would be punished for biting my nails too. They would constantly be putting hot sauce on my fingers, trying to get me to stop biting your nails, which of course is counterproductive. But, nobody in the group would see anything as a sign of anxiety. They would see it as a bad habit. This is a sign of the devil, and we need to get this out of you.
We've talked a lot about discipline on the children. What about adults? What if they did the wrong thing? What happened there?
That would range for sure. And, adults operated under sort of the exact same paradigm that the children did, that they had no idea what one of the home shepherds would consider like a heinous crime or a doubt or sowing schism, right? Sowing disbelief and separation amongst the followers. So they all had to sort of live in this juggling game, not to mention all of the forced sex, right? That they were all supposed to be having with each other. And one of the most common punishments, which was used on adults all the time, was just splitting up families. So if a couple seemed too happy together, if they, had too many kids, even though they were supposed to have a lot of kids, but then if they had too many kids, it was a sign that they were too happy together or too much of a family, so they could get split up. And of course, excommunication, right? So your final biggest punishment is disfellowship, where we're going to kick you out of the group that you have forsaken everything in your life to join. So that is one of those hugest, exit costs that I think gets people not to question things and to go along with things. They just don't want to lose everything they've given their life to.
Talk to me about persecution drills. What were they?
Oh, these are so fun. Usually in the middle of the night, although sometimes it would be like our exercise games, right? It would just be like all the kids go outside and the uncles, which were usually like the younger, older boys. And these were our fun games, right? And we were Heaven's Girl and they were the Antichrist soldiers. And we would be hiding and they are hunting us. And the persecution drills specifically were a lot more intense after several compounds around the world got raided by police. And in Argentina, they were all drugged to court. We were next door neighbors in Brazil. So we started doing these very regular persecution drills. And it was 100% about programming the children on how to lie to authorities, right? And we had an entire doctrine called Deceivers Yet True, which was all of these examples from the Bible and from Christian, quote unquote, history of times when people had to lie in order to achieve their goals. And so it was really this directly programming the whole ends justifies the means thinking into us. And I would say it also really gave us that torn feeling of, we'd read these stories of the kids that got ripped out of their homes to police and had to go through inspections, and it sounded terrible. But then we would read the parts about how they got to drink Coca-Cola and eat things with sugar in them. And that just sounded so exciting and so much fun. And it was just this constant, you're kept in fear of the outside world, but you also desire the outside world. And I really think it's just this constant thing that they use to then psychologically program us.
So what were some of those lies that you had to learn?
So there was so much time spent on how we were not a cult, right? And this is one of those things that looking back, you just go, maybe you're a cult if you're spending that much time on why you're not a cult. And then, just so programmed to talk at the youngest ages of how, this is the biblical concept of where sex comes from. This is how it's interpreted. This is when it changed. We absolutely don't do this anymore. Nobody's touched us. You can admit to the lightest of physical disciplines that would be acceptable in many countries, but never, 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 of course, the big, large beatings that goes on. And so much of it too was just teaching us how to downplay, how weird it is that you live in a commune with 150 people. So if you really were to talk about what our lives were like, it's obviously a cult. So much of this was training on how to just appear as your regular run-of-the-mill missionaries and absolutely lock away everything else that happens as this is only for members of the family because nobody outside can understand.
When did you realize that you wanted to get out of the Children of God?
As soon as I had my first thought.
That soon?
I say I was an atheist born to religious fundamentalists. I really think that it wasn't logical to me, and I was not into it from at least the age of 6. I remember being like, even if I go to hell, I'm getting out of here. But it wasn't until I was 14 and I had just gone to America for the first time, and it's 9/11, and I'm seeing live news on for the first time on television. And, I'm watching this horrific thing happening, and I'm hearing the grown-ups around me praising God for his judgment on evil America, which we called Babylon the whore. And, this is the beginning, right? This is the sign of the times. They deserve this judgment. And I'm watching this, and the crack in the brainwashing is just starting. And it's really when I hear a newscaster say the term religious extremists that these words sort of reverberate around in my brain for quite a while after that. And it's me thinking that we are also religious extremists if we are here celebrating this horrible thing that has happened as God's will. And, this for me was kind of the beginning of then this 1.5-year journey on, I would say, getting them to let me go. I realized that if they think they can save you, they try to save you. And exorcisms are not fun. And so I realized that I would need to really go all the way and commit the unforgivable of sins, which in an isolationist us versus culture that is all around sex at this time in my life means me very dramatically escaping out over the roof of the commune and going out into Guadalajara, Mexico to have sex with a boy that I've met outside the walls. And, now I'm bad, I'm sullied, and my parents are somewhat expected to find me a place to go live because I'm no longer welcome in the children of God.
So you planned that. You thought, what can I do that's going to make them let me go?
Yes. I tried smoking a lot because that was another really, really bad sin, but I kept never getting caught, and I was a little scared to get caught. So when I really just got fed up, I was like, that's it. I'm doing this.
So it's not as easy as just running away because they'd just come and get you.
I mean, at this point, so early on in the cult's history, they absolutely would tie down the teenagers, would not let them go, would send them to guarded compounds in the Philippines when they were considered problematic for extra labor. When it was the 2000s and in my time, you were allowed to go. You weren't given any help, but you were allowed to go, to the point that I say I'm just lucky that I was living in Mexico at that time and not Brazil, because that would have been just further for me to get back.
So how old were you when you were excommunicated, and what's the next steps there? Are you just kind of, bye, have a nice life?
I was 15. My parents found one of my stepsisters. So my mom, at some point in my childhood, had been married to this uncle who's 20 years older than her. And he had 7 kids before he married her. And so they kind of arranged this thing where I'm going to go live with my stepsister, who I've met 3 times, who has just left the cult herself a few years before and is, waiting tables in a bar at night to get herself on her feet. And they dropped me off with her. I had $0. I figured out how to get a job before I figured out how to get enrolled in high school, because I didn't have paperwork of any kind of background in schooling. And yeah, man, high school was just this realization for me that I'm from a different planet. I mean, I don't have a single part of me that can relate to anyone who's grown up in the normal world.
I imagine we can all see the bigger things that you might have looked at, oh wow, I'm allowed to read history books and that kind of thing. But was there anything that you were just this small thing that I now take for granted was mind-boggling to me?
One was when my daughter was a year old, maybe a year and a half. And I'm sitting on the couch in my living room, and she just toddles over to the fridge and opens the fridge and just starts eating grapes. It was just such a moment of ownership in her house and her life and her feeling comfortable to go get what she needed. And I couldn't even move. I was just sitting there on the couch I remember the first time I opened a fridge, I was 11 and I was in charge of cooking dinner for the entire commune. And just this level of freedom that my 1-year-old felt was mind-boggling and made me, of course, proud.
I know that you wanted to leave, but that sounds really hard. Like, you're 15, you have no money, you've left everything you ever knew. Was it as hard as it sounds?
It was extremely hard. It was, scary. And I just threw myself into what I think we all did when we got out of there. It was just like, I have to work so hard just to survive. So I'm not going to think about it, right? Like, I'm just going to throw myself into trying to pass as normal. And I really think one of the things that was the hardest in my journey was that I had somehow accepted this idea that the outside world was really hard and evil. And, I needed to hide everything about my background and my past in order to sort of find my place and outrun this trauma. And of course, now I know that does not work very well.
Are you allowed to, once you've been excommunicated, contact people within the cult? Are you allowed to see your mum or your siblings?
So at that time, it was a lot more relaxed. And I will say that my mom never cut ties with me. So she, I was always still able to call the commune where she lived and get a hold of her on the phone. It certainly wasn't, ideal. And to answer your question of, when you're 15, it's just hard. I was alone. I was angry. I didn't know anything about the world. And I'd just gone from living with 25 people to living by myself in an apartment in a different country and not knowing how to make friends.
You ended up joining the army, which, when you put it side by side with what happens in a cult, of course it's not a cult, but there are a lot of similarities. What made you do that?
I was looking for a guide. And so many of us that come from these repressed or isolated childhoods, I think we sometimes fall into toxic relationships because we're looking for this guide, someone that's going to help teach us about the world. Eventually, this becomes my friend Danielle, who I meet in the army. But at the time, I make this decision because I'm in this marriage. He's joining the military. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I do think there was a part of me that really craved the sense of community and the feeling of belonging to another group. You get this sense of mission, you get friends right away. These are all of the things that total organizations give you that are not necessarily bad things, and I remember working so hard for 6 years to get myself through high school, get myself through college. And then I just looked forward to being in basic training and not having to think, not having to make decisions. Those are all things that can be appealing for different reasons at different times of life.
We've talked about the child discipline, the sexual abuse, the sex with minors, all of those kinds of things that you either experienced or witnessed while living in the Children of God. Was there anything else that you, now looking back on, realize was potentially or is criminal?
I mean, certainly I just think the labor trafficking, right? Like, we were hundreds, thousands of children just constantly moved around the world for the purpose of our labor, really in raising funds for the organization, but in every aspect of keeping a society going. We children were the labor. And I think that ultimately is where we might find the most luck with sort of criminal pursuits.
I was going to say, do you think police will ever be able to, because they've tried, the police have tried quite a few times. You talk about these raids and, they've tried to do it here as well in Australia, but do you think police will be able to stop the Children of God? It's such a huge group of people.
At this point, so in 2009, they kind of fell apart. And realizing that most of the children were leaving, most of the original disciples were getting old and dying and were literally no longer able to support the cult. And they went through this kind of metamorphosis where they told their followers, just go live your lives, do all the things we told you not to do, reconnect to the world, and, we'll be here online being your church. And so I almost think maybe some of the impetus for going after them is gone because it is now, 1,400 people online. But, I do think that in the past, it was almost impossible for any action against the children of God to win because we, the children, were their defense, right? We were literally trained to be the enemy at the gates that would lie to the outside to protect our communes. Now, many of us are talking, right? So I think, who knows, right? We watch the Nexium trials and, these cult leaders getting what's coming to them. I was so excited to see Australia passing laws around coercive control, right? Because really the hard thing is it's so bad, but they are so good at violating laws or hiding what they do behind religious freedom. And so really crafting laws that have other ways to go after these kinds of people is very important.
If it's not looking like it looked when you were there, are there still girls, children, young women that we should be worried about that are still there?
There are. They did so much recruiting in parts of the world, like India, like Brazil, where I grew up, like any number of developing nations where joining this commune of white Americans living in your area was such a step up from potentially being on the street, being a sex worker, any number of things, right? So there still is a group of women and children who are stuck with the cult because they don't have anywhere to go. And the life that they lead is better than the life that they came from. And that, I think, is sort of one of the more vicious things that they've done as they've gone around the world and collected people.
I shouldn't just assume. I should probably ask, do you think that this group should be shut down? Because your family members are still there. That would leave them kind of out on their own. But do you think that the Children of God should be shut down completely?
Oh, I absolutely do. They not only trafficked us, but they filmed it. So there's a lot of evidence out there, and we just need, the right kind of courts. And it's always uncertain whether that can be done in the United States or whether there has to be some kind of international court. But, going after their money is always the way to shut down any church. So that is where I would like to focus.
What is your life like now? Do you have any lasting ramifications from what you experienced growing up?
Well, yes. I think, part of the journey and recovery is me operating under this belief that I can be perfect enough, I can achieve enough success that I can kind of erase the past. And I won't be this girl from a cult. And I've achieved these objective levels of success, but I'm still really, really broken. That I started to realize that, we talk so much in survivorship about coming to peace with what happened, but I think it's also coming to peace with that that's always going to be part of you, that no matter how hard I work, no matter how good I do with my daughter, I don't get to go back and have a nice childhood. I think those pieces, and then just living with whatever we have, right? Whatever combination of mental illnesses and autoimmune disorders, I think I'm sort of always learning how to balance some of these things. But, I also have a master's degree in organizational psychology and know, I think, all of this stuff about groups, which is an area that I work in, and I'm trilingual, and I taught my daughter to be trilingual. So I think one of the beautiful things about my life today is that when I stopped hiding it and when I stopped trying to sort of fit into these roles of being a perfect person and just realize I can accept all of these things that made me who I am, I've been, so much happier and so much more able to incorporate all of these different parts of me into who I am today.
Thanks to Daniella for sharing her story with us. If you'd like to learn more about her life, she's recently released a book called Uncultured, which is available now at all good bookstores, or you can find it through the link in our episode description. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Madeline Joannou. The executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you've enjoyed our Behind the Scenes of Crime special, let us know by leaving a review in your favourite podcast app or sending an email to truecrime@mamamia.com.au. Mamma Mia only refers to January 26 by its date, to acknowledge that it is not a day of celebration for all Australians. If you would like to learn more about what to do on January 26 if you're an ally, listen to Alira Potter's Fill My Cup conversation with Megan Waters. You can find the link in the show notes.